Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Zachariah Renfro, and in today's video we're going to talk about Anselm, Aquinas, and Pike. We're going to talk about Anselm and Aquinas's arguments for proving God exists, and we're going to talk about Pike's arguments related to divine omniscience. That is, the idea that if God knows everything, then there can be no free will, which is a pretty interesting topic in itself. So it'll be very interesting to discuss it with you all today and to really dig deeply into these topics. This comic you can see here is done by Existential Comics. They're a very interesting webcomic series done that examines the life of various philosophers. And here we see Aquinas, with a silly hat. So definitely pretty interesting. So this is what we're going to cover. We're going to cover some Neoplatonist background, and this is necessary to really dig into Anselm's ontological argument. Then we'll talk about Anselm with some detail. We'll talk about Aquinas, and then we'll talk about Pike's divine omniscience and its relation to free will. And hopefully by the time we come to the end of this, you'll have a stronger understanding of some different arguments related to the existence of God, and you'll have a stronger understanding of arguments related to divine omniscience and free will. So, who were the Neoplatonists? They were a group of different thinkers, most famous of whom was Plotinus. Augustine also counts as a Neoplatonist, who argued that reality was layered and that some things were more real or more perfect than others, and this followed Plato's ideas. The Neoplatonists postulated that, God was the highest and most perfect, and then came ideas which were either part of God or created by God. Then was the immortal soul. Next was the material world, and then finally is our own ideas, right? At each stage, the idea or concept is instantiated down to us, right? For Plotinus, these different ideas, such as the idea of a tree or the idea of goodness, it shines down from God, it emanates from God down to us. However, for the Christian thinkers, such as Augustine and Anselm, God created, God willed these things into existence. They come from the mind of God, and he willed them into existence, right? And we'll talk a bit more about this, but this background is necessary when we talk about Anselm, because there are a lot of thinkers over the last 1,000 years who, they read Anselm's ontological argument and they think, hey, this is a slam dunk. This guy's saying that we can prove God exists just by thinking about it, Well, that's silly, but they don't take into account the Neoplatonist background from which Anselm is operating. And within the background with which he's operating, the argument actually is a fairly solid one. But we're going to explore more about that. So, this is a physical representation of what I described, and I'm going to walk through it in quite a bit more detail. On the far left side, you have the biconditional arrow showing things that are more real and more perfect versus less real and less perfect. So the closer you get to God, the farther up you move, the more real and more perfect it is. The farther down you move, the less perfect and less real. And we see an approximation of what Anselm might have viewed. We've got God. He's got all these different features about him: existence, justice, compassion, goodness. And when I say he's got these features, what I mean is they exist as perfect forms within him, right? And they come down to us through him. But God is, the perfect embodiment of love, or the perfect embodiment of compassion, and then it comes down to us, right? Below that, you've got the immaterial soul, which shares in that form of eternity. It shares that eternal essence, but it is less perfect than God. Then beneath that, you have the material world, which is where we live, It is the world of flesh and blood, and it is, very imperfect. Lots of issues, right? But these things in the material world are instantiated from God. God willed them to existence, but the things that were willed into existence were things that, existed within the mind of God, right? And then we have our ideas, which sit beneath the material world, and they're instantiated by us using concepts coming up from on high. So that leads us to the line of instantiation. We've got the perfect immaterial forms, and then we've got the imperfect material reality. Now, with this line of instantiation, the thing we have to keep in mind is that us here in the material world, when we are conceiving of ideas in that realm of ideas, we cannot conceive of ideas that do not draw from the necessary reality of God or the forms. And what does that mean? Within God exists the idea of a perfect tree, right? A treeness from which all trees are instantiated. We can think of a tree, but we can't think of some object X that is completely unexistent within the mind of God, right? Because it would literally be impossible for us to think of this thing for which there's not some divine subject that we could draw from, right? So, and that's how this line of instantiation works, right? Because the knowledge that we receive, and this is something that Anselm and the Platonist and the Neoplatonist talk about, is drawn from these immaterial forms. It's instantiated into our minds a priori, and we can't have an a priori knowledge of something that doesn't exist as a form, right? So we got to keep that in mind, that all of our knowledge, all of our ideas, no matter how crazy they might be, come from some combination of forms or some combination of rational ideas. You think of a horse, well, that's a real animal. You think of a unicorn, not a real animal, but you're instantiating that part, the wings, and you're instantiating the part, the body, you're instantiating that part, the horn, right? And all those ideas exist. So you're able to, in your mind, combine them together into this very imperfect idea that exists, at a form lower than the material world, right? So that's kind of how that works. And this is especially relevant as we get into talking about Anselm's argument. St. Anselm of Canterbury, he lived about 1,000 years ago. He is a Benedictine monk, and he, obviously as a monk, wrote a lot about religion and philosophy. His most famous work is the Proslogium, but he also wrote the Monologium, as well as several responses. Cur Deus Homo, which is Why Did God Become Man? But in Proslogium, chapter 2, he makes his famous ontological argument in which he argues for the existence of God. And the argument, and keep in mind this is coming from classical Latin, is written in Latin, but translated out, it is something like this. Therefore, if that which nothing greater can be conceived exists in the understanding alone, the very being which nothing greater can be conceived is one which a greater can be conceived, that it being existing. But obviously this is impossible. Hence, there is no doubt that there exists a being which nothing greater can be conceived, and it is both in understanding and in reality. So what does that mean? Anselm is saying that if you can create an idea, if you can conceive of an idea of a being that's greater than all other beings, which there's no possible thing that could be greater than this thing, then obviously it must exist. Because if you can conceive of this greater being, but it didn't exist, then your conception would not be the real thing. Meaning that he's saying that if you conceive of this idea, then obviously it must exist, because existing is better than not existing. And you're drawing your ideas within this Neoplatonist context, right? So let's go back a slide and kind of work through this in detail. So in the realm of ideas, we are conceiving of this being that's greater than all other beings, of which nothing greater can exist. Well, we, think about here in our material world, there's a good man and there's a great man and there's a man who's even greater than all the other men, you know, well, it obviously couldn't be something here in the material world, so we have to look up higher, to the immortal, immaterial world, the realm of the soul and all that. Well, it can't be the soul of a person because, we can imagine a greater person, a greater soul, so it has to be this divine thing. It has to be, God existing above all and creating from all everything, right? So what Anselm is saying is because we've got this line of instantiation and we can create, right? Because that's what conceive is means. We can create this idea of this being which is greater than all other beings, then it must be that that being exists, right? Because we're instantiating it down from the mind of God, right? So it presupposes that you've got this immortal, immaculate God from which you're drawing these ideas. In some ways, it's a bit of an empirical argument, but it's based in a Platonic worldview. So, a couple of quick notes. Anselm talks about this. There's a difference between understanding versus conceiving ideas. Conceiving is to create, to combine ideas and create something. Understanding is just thinking about something that already exists, right? That's the difference. Additionally, this something that, and this is something I kind of mentioned before, because God is the source of all creation, right, and everything is instantiated from Him, His existence is necessary. It's a necessary thing. And we know when it comes to God as a source of creation and things being instantiated from God, we see this throughout the writing of Anselm. He describes God as compassionate but passionless in himself. He describes God as being the true embodiment of love and all that, right? And the way he describes particularly compassion, right? The form of compassion exists within God, but God himself doesn't will himself to be compassionate because that is a moving of the body, that is a moving of, the heart. God doesn't move in that way, but his actions as we see them are compassionate because they get instantiated down into that material world. So that's kind of how we understand that Anselm is operating from this Neoplatonist context. As I talked about before, in the material world, you can only conceive of ideas which are instantiated from existent higher forms ideas. So in some ways, and this is something which Anselm doesn't talk about, but it is something to keep in mind, our ideas would be bounded by existence in this Neoplatonist world. So you can only think within the framework of what exists within the perfect God. Then additionally, just a restatement, and I'm going to lay this out, line by line. Since all ideas are instantiated from more perfect ideas drawn from God, if you can conceive of a being that's greatest of all, that being that's greatest of all will necessarily contain existence as part of its being, and it necessarily must exist, right? Because, again, in the Neoplatonist context, all of our ideas are instantiated down. So if you're able to conceive of that being, then that means that necessarily that being must exist. Now, Anselm, a lot of philosophers, Descartes, Hume, Kant, Hegel, they've all kind of sparred with this argument, but it is one of those that continues to be relevant over time because it is the case that Anselm is saying something very important. And even if it's not necessarily within a Neoplatonist case, but if we live in a world created by God, then it would be very likely the case that we could understand God, that we could come to understand that God exists, right? So that's what Anselm is saying. He is using it in terms of Neoplatonism, and how convincing this argument is to you will depend on how bought in you are on Neoplatonist ideas. They're not as popular now, but there was a point in time where they were quite popular. With that being said, Anselm's arguments depend on that Neoplatonist worldview. Once you're outside of that Neoplatonist view, the arguments kind of fall flat. Then we get to Aquinas. This is several hundred years later. And in some ways, he's a Neoplatonist. In some ways, he's Aristotelian. In the Summa, he describes God in many Platonistic ways, but in other parts, he's more Aristotelian. One way in which he's more Aristotelian is he has a focus on discovering truth through experience and experimentation, which is something that Aristotle was quite into as well. About half of Aristotle's written works are works of biology and science, right? Talking about different creatures and animals, and he didn't just sit and ponder these things. He made observations and looked at them and all that. And Aquinas, coming from that tradition, that Aristotelian tradition, argues that we can get to know God based off of experience and reason, and that if a person wants to, a non-Christian can even come to know God through reason. This is something that's talked about in the Bible, and it's something that medieval thinkers used to justify their heavy reliance on the works of Plato and Aristotle. And it's worth noting that, Aquinas isn't saying that a non-Christian will necessarily come to know God, and he's not saying that any person who gets experience in the world will come to know God, but just that it's possible. If you go through life with an open mind, then it is possible you can come to know God. You could also come to the opposite conclusion, which according to Aquinas would be wrong, but his argument is that based off of reason, you can come to know God. And he created 5 arguments to prove that. There are arguments from motion, causation, contingency, degrees, and teleological. We're going to go through each of those one by one and talk about them a little bit. The first 4 are basically kind of the same, but in relation to different things. And then the final one, you've probably heard a variation of this somewhere. So the first argument is the argument from motion. In the world, in life, we see things happening, we see things moving, we see things going on, and there had to have been something down the line that set everything into motion that was not moved itself. Otherwise, it would be an infinite regress. And we need to keep in mind, in the time of Aquinas, they did not believe that an infinite regress was possible. They didn't think it was possible for something to be infinite, except with the exclusion of God, perhaps. In the time of Aquinas, if something went into an infinite regress, then it was viewed as obviously invalid, obviously false, right? In our modern times, we have a little bit different thoughts in regards to infinity, but that is something we got to keep in mind. So the world's in motion. Everything that's moving must have had something to move it. And we track this all the way down the line. There must have been an unmoved mover that set everything in motion. Next is the argument from causation. The world's full of causes and effects. Everything that's ever happened, you can draw a line going back and find the cause and the effect. And Aquinas argues that somewhere down the line there must have been an uncaused cause, because again, if there wasn't, it'd just be an infinite regress of cause and effect. But somewhere down the line there was an uncaused cause that set everything in motion. So that's the argument from causation. Next is the argument from contingency or argument from necessity. Different translations will phrase this differently. The world is full of causes, and whatever cause those causes must exist and all have always existed. Otherwise, nothing would exist. So, building from the argument from causation, you start off with the world is full of causes, and the thing that caused those causes must have always existed. Because if it were possible for the thing that caused the causes not to have existed, then the causes that we have wouldn't exist. Then we've got the argument from degrees. So this is a bit more on that Platonist side. Things can be more or less good. They can be more or less perfect. Therefore, there must be something that's the most perfect and the most good, right? And that's that most perfect thing, that most good thing is God. And then the teleological argument, our world has order and logic to it. Things happen through a series of cause and effect. Things tend to occur in a logical way. So therefore, all these things must be moving towards some kind of purpose, some sort of telos, and it must have been God that created that telos, that purpose for all the things in the world. So those are the 5 arguments of Aquinas. How convincing these are to you is up to you to decide. I do think there is something convincing about these arguments, but there are a lot of people that disagree with that. And, it's worth noting, on YouTube especially, you can find tons of videos of people, disproving Aquinas' arguments and saying, I found this flaw in the argument from motion, for example. They'll say, oh, well, it could be the case that there is an infinite regress. And they'll be like, slam dunk, Aquinas, you're a fool. But, we got to keep in mind that the framework Aquinas was operating from was a theological framework. He wrote his Summa Theologica as, and he says this in the preface, as the essential guide to understand the basics of Christianity. And, I want you to see, the size of this thing, for scale. This is my hand, right? I mean, it's 1,000 pages of small triple line text. I mean, it's not a small book. A lot of thought was put into it. And, when it comes to talking about God and God's actions in the world, Aquinas isn't just limited to these 5 arguments. These are his 5 most famous arguments, but he spends a lot of time talking about the necessity of God and talking about being able to determine God's actions in the world and, proof for the existence of Christ and, all these other things. It's all built towards a larger purpose. These 5 arguments are just to prove that there is a God of some kind. With these 5 arguments, you don't even get necessarily to the Christian idea of God. You get to basically an Aristotelian conception of God or a Platonic conception of God, which is God as some, thinking form above everything. And with Aquinas, we obviously would like to think that that is not what God is. God is a personal God, a God that came down in human form. And Aquinas does go on to prove that later in the work, but these 5 arguments are what we see the most of. Now we move on to Nelson Pike and his article on divine omniscience and voluntary action. And I know this is a little bit of a change from our previous bit talking about Aquinas and talking about Anselm, where they're busy trying to prove the existence of God. Pike is arguing from a different perspective. He's saying that if God exists and if he's omniscient, then God being omniscient, that is all-knowing, knowing things in advance, then by definition there cannot be free will, right? Because the definition of knowledge, as we see up here, implies, S believes P, S is justified in believing P, and then P is true, right? Well, it's that last bit, P is true, which by definition, if God was omniscient, would mean that anything he knew prior to it occurring was destined to happen. And he uses an example of lawn mowing. He says, imagine Smith mows his lawn on a Saturday. Imagine also that 80 years before, God had known that Smith would mow his lawn on a Saturday. If that were the case, then there's nothing that Smith could have done on the Saturday that would not have been mowing his lawn. He was basically forced to mow his lawn because it was predetermined in advance, right? So Pike is arguing in kind of an extension of Calvinism that if there's an all-knowing God, that it implies that God knows things before they're going to happen. Part of his argument relates to the knowledge as like a category of things. So he argues that human knowledge is contingently true. So you look at the example of having a good friend. You've got a good friend, Bill, and you know that Bill every Saturday goes and gets fried chicken from KFC. It's Saturday, so you know that Bill's going to get fried chicken. But it could be the case that Bill decides he wants McDonald's that day and he doesn't go get fried chicken. That doesn't mean that your knowledge was completely false from the get-go. It just means that it was contingently true. It could have been true, it could have been false. However, divine knowledge, according to Pike, is necessarily true. It's necessarily true because God, if God is perfect and omniscient, cannot have a false belief, and contingently true knowledge can produce false beliefs. Now, when it comes to divine knowledge, there's a possibility that perhaps divine knowledge is a bit different from human knowledge, and I'll talk about that in just a second. So, Pike says that, even though he's presenting these arguments from the omniscient God and for the lack of free will, he says that there are philosophical and theological alternatives, such as about the nature of God or the definition of knowledge. So let's kind of break that down, right? So with human knowledge, the way that we understand things, it is knowing specifically one thing. But if God is omniscient, and if he is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, and if he's all-knowing, and if he is perfect, and if he is immaterial and exists above and beyond our understanding, then it could be the case that God's knowledge might be like a type of probabilistic knowledge. And what do I mean by that? Like that God could be wrong? Well, no. What I mean by that is that God could know all outcomes, right? Because if God is infinite, if he is the beginning and the end, if he is the unmoved mover, the uncaused cause, if he is all these things, then why would it be beyond God's power to know this infinite contingent web of different actions? So we go back to the lawn mowing example. God might know that Smith is going to mow his lawn on Saturday 80 years from now, but God might also know that Smith might not do that. God might also know that Smith might go to the park or eat a hamburger or any other number of things in such to where God could be knowing of all possible outcomes, and that each outcome could be true in that Smith is a rational agent with free will, and God will know all true outcomes, right? Which is a long way to say that it could be the case that if God is all-knowing, that he's all-knowing in the broadest sense of the word. He's all-knowing as far as every contingent possibility. He knows what's going to happen if Smith mows his lawn. He knows what's going to happen if Smith doesn't mow his lawn, right? And both of those things could be true. And in some ways, I think that definition of omniscience is a bit more impressive, right? A God that just knows one thing, that Smith is going to mow his lawn, seems a lot less impressive in theory than a God that knows every possible outcome, right? The God that knows all would seem to be the God that could determine every outcome, like the same way that a chess player can think 5 moves ahead. Perhaps God can think an infinitely many number of moves ahead, right? So when it comes to divine knowledge, we should be careful as far as trying to assign it a human understanding, right? Because we go all the way back. Let's go all the way back to the Neoplatonist background, right? We see here that the way God exists is much, much different than the way a human exists. And if that's the case, then why would it not be the case that God's knowledge is different as well? So with all that being said, I really hope you've enjoyed watching this video. If you're someone who's found this on YouTube, get a like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. If you are a student in my class, I can't wait to hear from you during the weekly discussions. The topic of the existence of God and the provability of God and divine omniscience, they're always very interesting. So I can't wait to see what you all think and to hear from you in the future. Thank you so much. Bye bye.